Welcome to our webinar on how to run a successful supplier selection. Winter's upon us in London, and schools have gone back, so it's time for our webinar series to start again. So we're running a number between now and Christmas. Today's is about supplier selection, what to do, what pitfalls to try and avoid, based upon the experience of the speakers that we have. And among us are Alan Reid, who you'll be hearing from next, and then my colleague Jeremy and me, who will be explaining various parts of the selection process from a supplier's point of view. So we hope it's useful for you. The session's being recorded and we'll publish this over the next couple of days. We'll also be sending you that link so that you'll be able to download it, and your colleagues could listen as well. What we'd like to do today, we'd like to make this as interactive as we can. So chat is available for everyone, and we'll be putting some questions and some thoughts out there. We used to run a lot of polls, but we just get answers back saying yes or no. It's not very qualitative. So if you agree with anything we say or disagree with anything we say, please put it in the chat. Or if you've got any other thoughts you want to contribute, please put it in there, and then we can blend that into the session as well. So that would be very valuable feedback from you guys and your own experiences as well. And just remember, even if you haven't been through tender processes, every piece of input can be useful and other people can learn from it. So please, if everyone helps each other. We've already got some questions in from some suppliers, or some participants already. So we'll run through our presentation and discussion, and then at the end we hope to have 15 or 20 minutes worth of conversation and discussion at the end. So the agenda today, obviously, why supplier selection is so important. You're creating a long-term relationship, which is key to your business. Some practical tips, how to run a process, and then a conversation piece between myself and Jeremy, but we'll be basing that on some key attributes of the process and our findings of it, and then audience Q&A as well. So on that basis, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Alan, and he's going to talk about his experience in what works and what doesn't and how to do it correctly. So, Alan.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. Good morning, everybody. My name is Alan Reid. I'm an independent consultant within the membership and wider not-for-profit space. I've probably managed something like 200 vendor selection processes on behalf of non-profit clients. So I'd like to share some of what I find really makes a difference from a consultant's point of view, and then later we're going to that for sharing.
That's better. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I'll go through from what I find really works and what makes a big difference, and then we'll hear it from the supplier's point of view as well. That of course those are the people who are doing vendor selections every single day all year round. So let's get into that. First of all, what I think it's worth covering off are some really typical problems with supplier selections in the not-for-profit space. The single most common problem I find is that people underestimate the amount of time and effort required by the internal team. So some easy metrics are that for every potential supplier you issue a tender document to, that you include in your process, you should calculate that it's going to consume about 2 days of time per supplier throughout the process to evaluate them properly. And that's because it takes a certain amount of time to review their document, but also you're going to go through meetings with that supplier, you're going to take up references from that supplier, you're going to do due diligence and queries and query resolution. So 2 days per supplier, and then you multiply that up by the number of people on your team who are going to be involved in that process, and it quickly becomes if you take the totality across your team, 10 and 12 days and more for each supplier. And what people then do is they'll invite a huge list of suppliers to take part. They'll underestimate how much time it's going to consume from their team. Different team members will dip in and out, which means that they can't have the same view across all of the suppliers because they're not available for all of the meetings. And then it becomes impossible to then do an apples and apples comparison across people. And then people just rush, they get exhausted, and they just kind of, oh, for goodness sake, stick a pin in that one. And we'll go with them, and with hilarious consequences, lots of misunderstandings later. What often happens as well is that people don't recognize that matching together an extremely complicated offering like a supplier's software for CRM or a website, membership system, fundraising system, that's a really complicated offering, and the supplier is complicated as an organization. You yourselves are complicated, so bringing together these complicated things and then trying to get the ideal match for them takes an awful lot of conversation, takes an awful lot of time, and an awful lot of clearing up of misunderstandings and so on. And yet we still see people who their only engagement with the supplier, or their only significant engagement, is that they come in, will do a 45-minute presentation, and then they'll expect themselves to be able to make a decision off of the back of that. And it's so far from the detail that you actually need to make a decision for someone you're going to be basing your next 10 years of working on with, that really you're better off not doing it. So what we recommend, what I always work through, is a series of engagements on particular topics, like what's your approach to project implementation? Let's go through your approach to digital engagement with external stakeholders. How are you going to bring our internal staff on board with different business processes? All of those are different engagements, different meetings, different presentations, so that you can then start to get the detail that you need. And then something else that comes out very strongly in particularly highly formalized not-for-profit vendor selections is what I call an arm's length approach, which is another way of saying an approach that's based on deep suspicion and mistrust of suppliers. So in the very old-fashioned way of running vendor selections, it used to be the case that a document would be issued or made available on a web portal, and somewhere in there it would say things like, if you talk to any of our staff at any point during this process, then we'll presume you're corrupt and we're going to drum you out of the process. And that kind of is emblematic of the idea that all of the different suppliers are at risk of trying to bribe somebody. I know that's extreme, it doesn't happen, but at risk of trying to manipulate someone. They're going to hypnotize people through their salesy behavior. And while you do need to run a disciplined process, and you do need to manage things through channels, essentially, you also need to be able to have conversations with your potential providers. You need to be able to be listening to them as well as just pushing them down a funnel. And this approach of deep mistrust and deeply suspicious approaches to providers, all it ends up resulting in is that once you have picked your provider and you're then going through your initial stages of your project, then turn into a series of horrible revelations where all of the things that should have been discussed and should have been brought out are not, are then revealed during the early stages of the project, which is going to cause you to get shouted at and fired if you're very unlucky. So having that much more engaged process early on, and much more kind of collaborative process, can avoid a lot of misunderstandings. So then the real problem with that kind of process is, once you've picked your supplier, and you've paid over some initial amount of money, you're in it. You own the problem. You're in it as much as they are, and it's extremely hard for both sides to extricate themselves from that kind of series of misunderstandings. So having a much more conversation-led and a much more detailed view of looking at your suppliers will avoid all of that. Okay, so another thing that's really very important is working on the basis of, how do I get the suppliers to show us their best? So how do I get the best out of them? And a part of that is allowing proper time. So, okay, we've got a complicated offering here. We've got some digital elements. We've got some back office elements. Let's allow some proper time to evaluate those things in a proper setting, and then ask questions and then have them tell us stuff and us respond to what they're telling us. Don't have it so scripted and so narrow that those things don't come out. You really want each supplier to be able to show the best of themselves. And if you've done that, then you're starting to establish the foundations of a long-term relationship, rather than risking people just telling you what they think you want to hear because you're not giving them time to tell you anything else. So simple stats on what can go wrong. A really terrifying 40% of procurements fail, which is where people are arguing afterwards. Potential legal disputes. Certainly, the project is severely hindered by arguments and mistrust with the supplier. So some of the biggest problems rely in a poor selection process where you're not giving enough time for conversations and clearing up misunderstandings. Keeping very, very narrow communications where people are not allowed the time and opportunity to tell you about themselves, clear up any misunderstandings around shared terms that you're using differently, and then resulting contract disagreements, which means that you're building your project on sand because everyone is arguing about who's going to do what, how much they're going to do it for, when are they going to do it, and of course the consequences of not giving proper time and attention to the vendor selection process is that you're likely to find out that you've got surprises on costs later on. You're stuck between your board and your supplier with differences on costs. You'll find that you're doing more than you thought you were doing because the supplier hasn't agreed to do things you thought they'd agreed to. And then, of course, lost time and momentum on the project, and ultimately a real risk of project failure. So the more you invest in your vendor selection process, treat it as actually a substantial part of your project rather than just a hurdle to get through, the less likely you're going to encounter all of those problems, and the more likely you are to set up a solid foundation for your project. So with that, let's get into some practical advice of how to make it work through the different stages of your vendor selection process. So I'll hand over to Steve, if I may. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. So this next section is called How to Run the Perfect Process. I don't think anyone's ever going to run the perfect process, but certainly we hope we can highlight areas where we think the processes can be better for you, the buyers, and for your suppliers, because actually it's important that suppliers feel comfortable in these processes as well, because you'll get more out of them. So if we go to the next slide, there are 6 parts to this that we're going to cover. I'll cover the first 3, but discuss them with Jeremy, then we'll swap over. So the first one is building your team. So essentially this is it's you working out internally who your decision makers and contributors are. So a clear point on that is this is not a decision. This is not a process that should be decided upon purely at the top level and then imposed upon the rest of your organization. It's got to be comprehensive. It's got to be participatory. And everyone's got to feel that they're part of the whole thing. So you need to take staff with you rather than impose these sort of systems upon them, because otherwise you're not going to get that adoption that you want. So make sure you've got a team that goes across the organization, but also down the various levels of the organization as well. And it's also about giving people the authority or the comfort to be able to contribute to the process when you're trying to capture what sort of things they need in their departments, what sort of things are going to help them personally and from the business point of view and from the overall organizational point of view. But the downside of that is you could end up with too many people in the process. That's slow, it's expensive, and it actually means you can't quite often see the wood for the trees. So there's a whole range of different areas in the team selection. But if I can just touch on one point with Jeremy, in your experience, Jeremy, what sort of what sort of time allocation do you think this could take? Because a lot of organisations are fearful about involving staff because they think that might take a lot of their time, or they involve staff and don't give them any time at all. So what's the sort of participation that you think should contribute to a good process?
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and good morning, everybody. So look, I think the first thing to say, Steve, is that this often depends on the size of the organisation and the nature of the purchase that the organisation is making. And our experience at Smart Impact is focused on membership management systems, CRM, web portals and websites. And, I suppose the problem with the systems we sell is that they're pretty business critical. So they're the types of solution that will really define in many respects how organizations will work operationally for long periods of time. So you do need to have a good selection of people involved in the process. And I completely agree with what you're saying about the fact that that needs to have kind of depth and breadth, but you probably need to find the right roles for the right people in that. So typically the organizations that I work with have a project core team or a project board. As Alan said, you need to treat the procurement process as part of the overall project. And that project board is established early on to lead the entire initiative. And you need again, depending on the size of the organization you've got to be realistic about who can be involved, but typically you have someone who is the project sponsor. So ultimately that's the person who's responsible to the business for leading the project and delivering the new system that you're implementing. You probably also need someone who is a business owner. So that's the key person in the organization who's going to benefit from the output of the project. So, typically in our types of projects, that's a director of membership or a director of education, or someone who is looking for a significant change through this project. You're going to need a project manager, and again, that project manager should ideally be assigned from the beginning to lead and run the procurement process with the project board right through to the delivery of the system. You probably need someone from the technical team to support around data integrations and any technical aspects, questions around what the rest of your technology stack is and how what you're fitting in, what you're delivering fits into that. And ideally, and again, the size of the organization tends to determine this, but ideally someone who can lead business requirement gathering in the organization, so a business analyst or someone with that skill set. Now, again, in smaller organizations, that mix of roles is often split between different people, which is often a vagary of this type of procurement exercise. But understanding those key roles and having those key roles in mind, really, really important. Then to touch on what you described about getting the insights and requirements from end users, the person who's wearing that business analyst hat probably needs to go and identify subject matter experts within the business. Now, you could say we need to interact with everyone, but I think that's pretty impractical in most organizations. So you need to find someone in each department who can speak confidently and authoritatively about how business processes run and what the outcomes of those business processes are. And those people, the interface between the project board and the subject matter experts, are probably the people that need to document requirements and come up with that list of requirements. And they probably need 2 or 3 days to do that. That's pretty big job to go and understand exactly what a particular function in the organization needs from the organization. So, I mean, time commitment, very difficult to put a particular number on it, but to have that right mix of people and people doing those roles, absolutely critical as the first step to have that core team for running that process.
Thank you. So there are a number of interesting points in that. So I think the first is you don't have to have a massive team, but you should have key people driving it, the sponsor, the business owner as well. And ideally, and not every organization can have this, a good project manager but you do need someone to run the process and drive it and keep it to time scale as well. And it's from a supplier's point of view, it's really important, because if you have a process and a team that just isn't properly resourced and is slightly chaotic, a lot of suppliers will opt not to bid or not to participate at later stages in the process, because they'll feel if you can't run a successful selection process, it doesn't bode well for a successful project. And that's very important, because good suppliers want successful projects. If you run a process that makes good suppliers more concerned about that, you may end up just with those suppliers that are quite happy to just bid through the process because they don't have an awful lot of successful work on their plate. So it's an important point, and it does happen. So you can get better suppliers by running a really good process. So it's the right team in the right combination, but with the right time to do it. So next area, the slides come through. So it's the creation of your ITT and the associated documents. So it's about what do you need to capture, how do you capture it, what do you need to share with your supplier, and it's a matter of getting it to the right degree. So we come across a lot of tender documents which are far too light in information. There's not enough information to be able to bid successfully, and when you therefore have a lot of Q&A that then is outside that tender document, where it's difficult for every vendor to be able to then monitor and capture everything that actually is needed, and therefore for everyone to bid on an equal basis. So that's very, very important. So how do you avoid that? Well, it's about spending time with across your organization and down into the various levels of your organization, which is why you need those people in your project team. But finding out what their requirements are, capturing as much as you can, but then going through a process of prioritization and working out exactly what's needed and what's not needed. And typically that would be, well, we'll talk about this in a little bit more, but not capturing absolutely everything that anyone thinks of and putting it in a document, because you, again, won't see the wood for the trees. It's about getting the core stuff in your first phase and then some other stuff later on. So War and Peace doesn't work. It can confuse suppliers. So if I can move over to Jeremy again, I mean, what are your key things if you've got, say, 500 to 1,000 different requirements, which we've seen quite a lot? How do you manage, how do you advise organizations to try and get that to a priority core order so that it's something that can be sensibly bid for by suppliers such as Smart Impact?
Yeah, Steve, I mean, I think if you're looking at a list that's long, what you've probably failed to do is consolidate and refine requirements and apply any scrutiny to them before you have sent them to a provider. So you do need to prioritize. I think, the first thing is I would avoid a laundry list. What you don't want a set of requirements to be is a list of things that you don't like about your existing system. That's, it quite often happens, because that's quite often what people experience in the day-to-day. So try and strip out things like that. Perhaps apply a framework like Moscow or nice to have, need to have analysis to requirements. In terms of sort of line by line items, I really would try and keep it, thematic and really focused on things that you absolutely need to have. And in my experience, the easiest way to really understand what an organization is looking for from an output perspective is to provide thematic requirements as well as functional ones. So describe what the business is looking to achieve by implementing the technology and what the overall outcomes of the implementation should be, rather than just doing them line by line.
fine. So I think I agree completely. I mean, 500 to 1,000 sounds a lot, and it is a lot. And this, I can think of many in quite large organisations where that comes out, but also in small organisations, and it is unwieldy. Also, I think it's important to make sure that what is in your ITT document is relevant for the bid. It should be about what you want the system to do and how you think that you can take it forward and work with the supplier. That's really what this is about. I know a lot of organisations, and we have them all the time, that proudly say, look, we've spent 9 months or 15 months documenting all our as-is processes, and here's a brilliant set of flow charts and loads of requirement documents and all of the user stories that we had and so on. And the truth of it is that gives you a very detailed insight into what the system currently does that isn't required anymore because you're replacing it. But most suppliers will find that too much information. It can mean that you can go into certain parts and it's very useful, but most suppliers are after the to-be cases. What do you want the system to do and how do you want to do it? And every supplier will want to go through a discovery process once they start the implementation anyway. So again, please focus on getting the information about what you want the system to do. Tell people what the problems are that you've got now, but we as suppliers don't need to know the massive detail of every flow and every piece of information that you currently have got, because quite a lot of that will be optimized and replaced anyway. So
I think the other thing about doing it that way round is that quite often you miss the lens of what the technology's potential is to impact and change a business. So talking to providers and talking to peers about how technology they've implemented has improved processes, improved how the organization operates is probably equally as important as documenting hundreds and hundreds of individual line items. And I mean, it is extraordinary. I still see RFP spreadsheets that say things like must be able to capture middle name, must be able to capture date of birth, and just have really no sort of relevance to how a modern system works. So the requirements should be informed by the change you're looking to effect from the investment as much as from day-to-day functional line items.
Yeah, and exactly, and all that stuff will be captured in the discovery process anyway, so there's little point in documenting such detail in your tender document because systems will do it in the first place. Right, so on to some more important things, and we'll need to go at some pace, even though these are key parts now where it's the engagement side. So it's very, very key to understand that successful projects aren't just about good software and having a good selection process. It's all about the rapport you've got with your supplier, and we'll return to this theme quite a lot. So to me, it's how you engage your suppliers and how you create and measure what that rapport and relationship could be in the tender process that'll dictate how successful your project is, among other things. But the rapport is a very key thing. Great suppliers can do good things even if the project has its own obstacles. Poor suppliers can't, and if there's not rapport, they might have great software, but if your relationship isn't good, it often doesn't end up in the success. So how do you find a short list of suitable suppliers, and how long should that supplier list be, and so on? So the reality of this is we see all types. I've seen lists that are just starting with 3 suppliers because there's been heavy pre-selection. And I think that's too low. I think I've seen long lists that are, believe it or not, 60, 70, 80 suppliers. There aren't even that many in this market, so they've gone absolutely wild in getting as many people through. And that just is an unwieldy process. You can't manage that too many people. And also beware, because quite often organizations will want to go and use management consultants to give advice around this, and there are very, very good ones in the market space. But again, some of those even will go out to the 40, 50, 60, anyone that wants to bid, and allow them into the process. It's not a service. It's not giving you a service. The consultant should be expert enough to understand who should be good enough to get your particular requirements, and create that long list, which to me, a long list should be between 6 and 10 suppliers maximum, and then you go through the pre-selection and shortlisting after that. So you need a range of options and choices. Do you have a preferred technology already? If you're a fully Microsoft house, then you're going to be potentially limiting that to dynamic suppliers, which is, you know, the leading product anyway. But do you want to widen that across proprietary, across bespoke, across things including, say, Salesforce? So you need to think about your technology basis as well. But remember, the more suppliers you've got, the more it takes your staff to evaluate them all, and you've got to treat all of them equally. So it's going to take you and cost you a lot more money. So I would do a lot of pre-selection and try to essentially to try and keep that as limited as possible. One other thing I'd add to it is you're not alone, and you're not the first people to go through and buy this sort of system. So if you've got a peer network, consult that peer network. What have you got? How have they done it? Who are you working with? How good have they been? Were they great at the beginning and did they fall off? Have they consistently been good? Is their support excellent? So get that network. And if you don't have a network at the moment, just find people like you and ring them up. LinkedIn is a great way to contact other people in the same roles as you. And you'll find in this particular market space, everyone's really helpful, because they realize that the more help you put out, the more help can come back. So don't be fearful of that. And I'm always astonished how very few people we talk to in bid processes have actually talked to other organizations about their feedback. So I think that's a key one. So Jeremy, last point to ask you, and then I'll hand over to you. But how do you think? How would you take your long list and start to whittle that down to a short list? What guidance can you give around that?
Yeah, so I mean, look, firstly, don't forget what Alan said at the top of the webinar, right? For every single provider you engage with, if you're really going to engage properly, you need to expect to spend 2 days per person involved in the process. So, you know, you want to be realistic. I think my advice is aim for a short list. So undertake market discovery. There's quite a lot of things that you can do to do that. You can engage with suppliers at industry events. You can attend webinars. You can have a look at things like supplier directories. You can do some Googling. You can undertake some light touch market discovery by having conversations with organizations without too much sort of involvement. And of course, talk to peers, as you suggested, Steve. But aim for a long list to be that, really identifying, you know, 5 to 8 organizations that you feel could really do what you need, but then have a very hard target to whittle that down to a short list of probably 3 or 4 providers maximum that you're really going to engage deeply with. If you try to do more than that, you run the risk of it turning into a beauty parade. You run the risk of suppliers just looking at the process and saying this is not a serious process and walking away. And you run the risk of just spending a lot of time confusing yourselves, because there's going to be a hell of a lot more similarity between what providers can deliver than differences in reality.
Thank you. So yeah, I think this is obviously the first key part, because you're finding out who you're going to be talking through the whole process and who you're going to be working with for the next 5 or 10 years. So it's really important. So do your homework before you even start on this process and send the documents out. So
the next stage of the process we're talking about is supplier evaluation. So to an extent, I'm imagining that you've completed your RFP process, you've sent that out to organizations, and you've had responses back. So you're going through responses in detail. So this phase of the selection is all about reviewing the submissions and reviewing the discussions that you've had with suppliers up to that point. You need to obviously evaluate how closely they match your defined needs, and we do find that a scoring matrix of some sort that produces an objective way to compare is very, very wise and a sensible thing for people to put in place. Shouldn't become a straitjacket. In fact, you know, the one risk I would say is you want this to be as much a evaluation of whether you can work with the organization as whether or not they sort of match up to scoring requirements in a paper exercise. But having some objectivity definitely helps when it comes to decision making. I think there are two critical things that you're looking for when you're evaluating suppliers, and you know, a lot of this work should already have done in terms of bringing your shortlist together. But question number one is, do they have a track record in the space that you're looking in? So are they experts at delivering the type of solution that you're looking for, and do they have recent experience of doing that? And then the second is, to what extent can they cover the majority of your requirements with their solution? So this is probably something you need to evaluate to get an idea of the coverage of their solution with your requirements, but it's also about looking at what they've delivered for others and how closely those organizations match up with what you are doing. So track record in those two areas is really, really important. You want to look at case studies of other organizations that they've worked with. You want to evaluate.
Sorry,
so track record, important to understand who they've worked with. Look at case studies, look at testimonials. If they're worth their salt, there should be a lot of that available on their website. Talk to peers. I think, you know, very, very importantly as well is the question of cultural fit. And you know, that is probably something that you're going to be looking to the supplier pitch and pre-RFP engagement to understand. And it's much more subjective, but you also need to be thinking, can we work with this supplier? Do we like the way they communicate? Do we like the way they deal with challenges and questions, etc.? So Steve, bearing in mind those two critical things around track record and coverage of requirements, how should an organization go about evaluating those key criteria when they're reviewing RFP responses and ITTs?
I think there's a whole range of different ways, and different organizations prefer different ones. I mean, I think, you know, there's obviously an RFI stage that some go through, which is essentially just asking for general corporate information and so on. That can be useful. It means that you understand a certain size of organization, their turnover, profitability, growth, that sort of thing. I personally feel what a lot of organizations focus too much on is asking questions around methodology, all the different steps you go through and so on. And on the face of it, that sounds really important, but actually putting that in a tender document doesn't really hit that goal, because you end up with some pre-prepared answers that every supplier did earlier being put into the document. I think a better way of understanding, rather than methodologies, how will you work with us? And don't put it in the document, do it in conversation. Ask the delivery manager or the project manager to be put forwards in any presentation, so that they can cover what they do, how they work with people, what reporting you get, what rapport you get, how you capture discovery information, all of these different things, because that's what's important, not the method that they follow through in the theoretical answer to an RFP document. So I would again focus on trying to ask the right questions about how will you work with us and make our particular situation better, because that tests that they understand what your particular situation is and where you're different as well. So I would certainly cover that part of it. Does that sort of cover what you're asking, Jeremy, or is there other parts?
I think so, Steve. So I mean, I think we focused quite a lot on the functional, the track record and the cultural fit. So I suppose to a degree that's the upside of things. But what else is important in terms of identifying a supplier? I'm talking things like their stability, their ownership, their relationship with platform providers, etc. To what extent are they important?
I think you presumably want to deal with someone that's done something like your system before. So case studies are very important. I would certainly do a lot of research around the supplier's website, look at the case studies that are on there, ring them up, ask them. Because actually, and we know through experience, quite a few customers find themselves on websites when they don't really have the greatest system that there is. So suppliers have lots of customers on their websites. Phone some of them up. If they're in your network, see what it's like. Check them out, because don't just rely on the supplier to give you a prism of 3 or 4 selected organizations that have got good stories. So you want people with a wide range of experience, but particularly people like you. If they've got the same functions as you, great. If they're the same size as you, even better. If they get the same level of IT support or project support that they can put in as you can, or not put in because you can't either, then find out all of that. So it's really, where have you done things, where have you been successful in providing systems to people like me is the key part. And just asking suppliers that question doesn't answer that question. It just gets you, the supplier selling to you and telling you what they think you want to hear. So again, do your research, use your peer networks, check out the customer case studies, use AI or Google search to just find other information about the supplier and their individual customers as well, because you'll find a lot more behind the scenes, and that will allow you to ask much more pertinent questions throughout the process of each different supplier.
Thanks, Steve. If you could get to the next slide, that would be helpful. So the next stage of a process, very normally, I'm not going to fall too much into the philosophical question of, having done all the work we've described on this so far, is this required? But it normally does form part of the process. So perhaps a question for you to think about in the background, Steve, is to what extent is this required? But in terms of hosting supplier pitches, this is when you bring suppliers in and you ask them to present their proposal to you, and normally at the same time present key aspects of their solution. And I think, as per the slides, you really want this to be an environment where prospective suppliers can shine. If you make this a kind of dragon's den grilling where everyone's uncomfortable, and don't forget, it's not just going to be the provider that's uncomfortable. Quite often in these meetings, if you approach them in the wrong way, everyone ends up a little bit uncomfortable and embarrassed. So you want this to be a constructive activity, which invariably they are, I have to say. I'm sort of worst case scenarioing in my head a little bit there. You need to set clear expectations for the session. So what the scope of the meeting is, what the goals you as an organisation are trying to achieve from having the supplier pitch to you, and be fair around timing and giving suppliers enough time to fit everything that you're asking for in. So a structured agenda of sorts is useful, but I wouldn't try and cram too much in, and I wouldn't try and make the agenda too prescriptive, because you just won't give the opportunity for organizations to shine in that context. You need to think about involving the right stakeholders. This is a tricky balance, because, you know, we've talked about in this session the need to engage as many different people in the process as is necessary to make the right decision, but inviting too many people just turns it into a lecture or a monologue, and won't enable you to have the discussion, Q&A and dialogue that you actually need for these sessions to be useful. And I suppose that's my final point. Make sure that within the agenda you are allowing enough time for discussion and Q&A, and ideally for that to be two-way. You don't just want it to be a lecture monologue from the provider. So I suppose, look, Steve, we do quite a few of these, don't we? So I think this is the end of the equation where we have quite a lot of pointy experience. Give us some of your worst case scenarios. What are the worst experiences that you've had in terms of these sorts of sessions?
I'll explain why I'm going to answer that in a minute, but I've done sessions like this when there are 30 or more people in a room, and often it's a room that's not big enough for 30 people, so everyone's uncomfortable. Most are focused on their particular area of interest, so are at best not interested and at worst bored in most of the other parts of the presentation. So if you want to involve that many people, please create breakout sessions that are relevant for those people, and then just have your core team in the main presentation. I've also done meetings where there have been 3 people, and that can't possibly represent the whole spread of function in any membership or not-for-profit organisation. So, but I'd like to make people think a little bit about where this is in the process. This is part 5 of a 6-part process of selection that we're covering here. And you'll have done a lot of work in creating your RFP, gathering the information to go into the RFP, looking at your suppliers, who should you pitch to, engaging with them, and so on. That's a lot of work and a lot of thought over quite an elapsed time. And what we really often find with the shortlist supplier pitches is suddenly this is an hour speed dating and that's it. And it's just not enough. You can't, this is your chance to get the idea of rapport, of beliefs, of enthusiasm, of methods, of trustworthiness, and so on. So why would you spend all of that time getting suppliers to this stage and then just give them essentially the equivalent of a speed date? It just doesn't, I don't understand it. So I would advise organizations to spend at least a couple of hours, if not a morning or an afternoon, with each prospective shortlisted supplier, because there should only be 3 or so of them, so it's not a lot of time. But make sure that there's enough time, and it's not all presentation. There's some break time, coffee time, where you can have a chat and find out what people are really like as well, because these are the people you're going to be dealing with for the next 5 years. So ask them to bring along project managers, ask them to bring along the delivery people, not just the sales guys or the exec board and so on, because I think that that's very important. And the other side of that is, once you've created enough time for this meeting, make sure your agenda matches the time allowed. We far too often find an agenda that is 5 hours long in a slot that is an hour or 2 hours long. It's not possible to do that, and everyone's under panic. So you just don't get the value out of the session that you should have done. So those would be my core thoughts on this.
I think that's the point, isn't it? After all this work, for it to turn into that speed dating session, feels like it's undermining everything that you've already done. But it does often feel, and I know this is only sort of one lens on it, but it does often feel like those short sessions are quite often the time that the decision is made, and so it's funny for it to be something that, you know, can fall foul of such a superficial engagement, you know. If I could have the final slide, Steve, this is going to be a pretty quick one, I think. So, you know, you've gone through this process, you've had an ITT response or an RFP response, you've met with your provider, and it's time to make a decision. So as I said earlier on, in terms of evaluation, make sure you have some sort of objective criteria, because you do need some way to make a informed, objective decision. You do want to gather feedback from everyone who's been involved in the process as much as you can, but this is probably where having that core project board to actually make that decision is necessary. But I think the key point here is actually make a decision. You know, quite often I see organizations undertaking this process, and after all the work they've gone through, them not able to make a decision, a kind of sort of analysis paralysis with all the information that they're trying to consume. I think that's undermining internally within the organization. If you're not able to make that decision, you know, everybody who's had a touch point will sort of roll their eyes a little bit about how decisive the team is. It's frustrating for suppliers who are pitching, because it becomes, you know, an endless regime of sort of chasing. Has a decision been made? Has a decision been made? And, you know, nobody likes that. And ultimately, if you haven't set up at the beginning of this process the criteria upon which you're going to make the decision, so you can make that decision, question whether the whole thing is worthwhile in the first place. So, you know, it's really important to prepare throughout this process to make a decision. I mean, Steve, again, best practices from your perspective in ensuring that you're able to make that decision.
I think there's many. Too long to go into here, but I think one of the key things is, if you've got a short list, and generally these things are very close, if you've got a good set of long lists and a good shortlisting process, you'll end up with good suppliers. So it'd be difficult to tell the difference, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't make a decision. I think you've got to somehow try and choose one out of those three. And a good example of where this can go wrong is when you've got to the decision cycle as per your timetable, and then thought, well, we can't make a decision, so let's have a load more questions, let's have a load more steps in it. It's a bit like running a mile race, and the athletes come around the final bend, and suddenly they find that there's 3 or 4 extensions and jumps to do, which is a big surprise to everyone, and that doesn't help. So if you aren't certain, choose what you think the best supplier will be on whatever basis you think, and then ask them to go through some extra steps. But don't ask all of the suppliers to go through extra steps on your shortlist, because that doesn't actually help you. If you can't tell the difference already, it's going to be difficult to tell the difference later on. So try and find a preferred one, subject to these extra steps, and then work with them in a very interactive way and collaborative way, because then you'll be finding the rapport again. And so I think just work closely and collaboratively as a sort of mini pilot, if you like, and that'll help you with to ratify your final decision.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, because of the shortness of time, is I'm going to merge together some supplier questions and some Q&A questions that have come in from the chat. So the first one I'd like to ask is, this is a kind of from the heart question from people running a vendor selection process. How does the client avoid the suspicion that suppliers are only giving them the answers that they think they want to hear? So we can do it really cheap, we can do it really quick, and to a really high standard. And so pick me, and I'll tell you that, you know, you'll find out the reality later, but it's too late. You've already spent your money with us. How do clients avoid that happening?
You want me to pick that up, Alan? So
yeah,
look, I mean,
great.
I'm sorry to say this, Alan, but unfortunately, I don't necessarily think there is anything that you can do to stop that happening, because I definitely do see and hear of that type of thing happening in our space, which is a shame, but I suppose a reality, particularly when organisations are very keen to pick up business. I think there are some internal guardrails that you can set up to support it. So make sure you have some expertise on your team. You know, that might be thinking about an external consultant to support this process if you're a bigger organisation, so that you've got some sort of insight and critical friend support. It might be, you know, making sure that you have realistic expectations, particularly around budgeting and planning a budget or a budget range, so that you can set some expectations with providers. But I think that the most important thing, you know, as much as you're having conversations with suppliers about what they do and how they work and what their technology does, talk to other organizations about the realities of their projects. So get some context about what it's really like to work with a provider or to deliver a project of this type, and, you know, I suppose wise up on the realities of the kind of project you're embarking on.
Great, thank you. And I guess one of the main points there, exactly as you say, is if a supplier is in the habit of putting their prices up after the project has been sold, you won't be the first time they've done that. So the key thing is asking their existing clients, how much did they start off with in the budget and how much do they end up with on the budget? And did you end up with a whole series of horrible revelations through the project? That's probably one of your best safety nets there.
But I think
okay,
so. It's not just budget, right? It's
yes,
budget's
yeah.
a big part of it, obviously, but it's not just budget. It's the quality of the folks that you're working with. It's
exactly.
can their software actually deliver what you need it to do? Have they actually worked with other organisations that are like you? There's a whole plethora of things. That's why getting that insight is really critical.
Yeah, 100%. So any horrible revelations that come out because they haven't told you stuff or there's been misleading or underestimating. So verify with their existing clients with very specific questions. Okay, a question about budgets. A lot of clients don't like to publish the budget because they have this imagination that the supplier could come in cheaper. Then they publish the budget and they'll increase it to their published budget. But in reality, what I find is it's the other way around, that actually the client's budget is less than the supplier would ideally charge for the project. So what's your sense of that? What should clients do in terms of publishing a budget, not publishing a budget? And what do you do when they do publish a budget, please?
Shall I answer that one?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I think it's vital that budgets are clear. It's not because we then come out 10 quid lower than the budget. But it's very clear that every supplier clearly has the best solution as far as they're concerned, but they know what the entry price is for the solution and how much it's going to cost to put it in properly. So no matter how good your tender process is, how good your requirements are, how good rapport is, and so on, if you've got half the budget that we know we need to make this work, then it's not worth your time talking to us. There'll be other suppliers that can go into that space, and you have to meet that budget, and you have to therefore make sure that they can actually deliver the function that you want in the way you want for that budget. But budgets are very important because they basically help you pre-select the suppliers that you're going to be dealing with. If you really, really, really like a supplier, but they're going to be, say, 50% more than your budget, maybe go and get some more budget. But it's important that there's that clarity, because there's no point going all the way through the process and doing all of the work and then finding out that it's unaffordable, because that doesn't help either organization. So I think that's very key. The other key part of this as well, and this is a bit sort of detailed, but you could have two identical organizations where one has got a great project manager, very well organized, very well drilled, clearly going to be a massively successful, clean project. And you could have another identical set of requirements in another organization where they've got no staff availability, no real experience, and it's just going to be a mess. You need a lot more budget for your supplier to help manage you through that process than the first organization. And that's why budgets are important. And that can make the difference in some cases of, say, £100,000 in large projects. So it's important that the budgets are there so that suppliers understand how viable the project is, and then do you a good service, because then you won't be wasting your time with suppliers that can't meet your expectations. So I think it's one of the key things that a lot of organizations, all organizations should do.
That is fantastic. Thanks a lot for the great advice from both of you. I'm really conscious of time, so I'm going to skip other questions. And then we already merged in the Q&A. Steve, could I hand over to you to say what Smart Impact has got coming up next?
Sure. So you got the slide on. So basically, we've got a series of webinars we run every month or so. You can see on the slides now, we've got 2 coming up in November. They're all different aspects of AI, which we've been doing quite a lot of work of with some key customers. So it's about deliverable, useful AI that you can go away and start to do after the event. It's not suppliers telling you that AI is going to take everyone to the moon and solve world peace. It's very, very practical organizational usages in not-for-profits organizations. So please register for those. And is there another slide, Alan?
Just your final slide.
There we go. So so thank you, everyone. We hope that's been a useful discussion and some insights that we've given you. If there are any questions you have, please do contact me. And as I say, we'll be getting in contact with you post webinar to send you the recordings and things like that as well. And any feedback you can give us on what you thought was useful, what you thought we could have covered better, would be very helpful, so that we can always improve our webinar program. So thank you very much. I hope that was enjoyable for you, and thank you for attending. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks,
everyone.